Hello, folks, and welcome to this week's Sod Pod. Currently, at the date when we're recording this, we're in the middle of March. Thankfully, from our last Sod Pod recording, things are looking up slightly from the weather front. By no means are we, I suppose, where we want to be, but thankfully, we're seeing a bit more of a positive trend. So, in this week's episode, we're joined by Clodagh, Bolger, and John Brennan. Well, folks, how are you keeping?
Well, Peter, how are things?
Good, thanks, Peter.
That's the job. So, come here, what's going on the grassland agro side of things? What's keeping you busy this time of year?
I suppose, yeah, us and our sales reps are busy the last couple of weeks doing fertiliser plans, calling out to farmers. There's a lot of fertiliser in yards at the moment. Just, I suppose, the weather isn't really on our side at the moment. There's not much fertiliser spread. I suppose from being on the road the last couple of weeks, you kind of are starting to see now cows getting out, farmers kind of taking I suppose, the advantage of, when the weather breaks there.
Yeah, look, you said it all there, Clodagh. Checking nutrient management plans is probably the hot topic now this time of year. Talking about the impact of the conflict in the Middle East is a fair hot topic there at the moment. Farmers are wondering why prices are going up, and I've been hearing queues of farmers queuing up with co-ops and that for fertilizer. So there's a lot of anxiety out there in regards to that. So I suppose part of our job is we're going out on farm with our dual calls with our ATCs and talking about things like that, and also reminding farmers the importance of minerals as well this time of year, pre and post calving. So they're kind of, I suppose, the main topics there at the moment.
Yeah, and sure, look, it's a lot of, I suppose, it adds to the stress. Look, spring by nature, it's a pretty heavy workload. Be it calving, getting stock out, fertilizer, thinking of silage cuts, etc. So when you throw the likes of this uncertainty into the mix, obviously, it's just another stress there. It's not needed, but look, it's where we're at. And I suppose something else, Grassland, you're doing a few or open days or teamed up with Agri Aware in terms of students, I suppose, giving a bit of a demonstration on all things soil health, bit of an overview on that topic. That was last week, was it? Or?
Yeah, so I suppose all three of us were involved in that last week with the Agri Aware. So we were in Grange, Garteen, and we were in Pallaskinnery for 2 days as well. So we were talking to students, I suppose, with other industry partners as well. So I suppose our station was all about soil health, 3 pillars of soil health, why it's important, why it's kind of important more so now than ever with the way, I suppose, fertilizer allowances and the price of fertilizer, how it can increase fairly drastically. Soil health is more important now so than ever. But yeah, there was good interaction on the day. There was a lot of students asking about, I suppose, potential project ideas and questions off teachers and stuff as well. So there was good interaction there.
It's a brilliant thing that our Agri have been organising there the last few years. It's great to see, young people being, I suppose, educated and brought up in an environment where they're actually going out on farm and experiencing the different things that happen, whether it's calving down a cow, talking about farm safety, and in our case, talking about the soil health side of things as well. I think it's a brilliant thing for young students coming up.
It is, no, it is, and definitely is great to see. And look, to be fair, I think was it yourself, Clodagh, there touched on like the 3 pillars: the physical, the biological, and the chemical. And it's probably something we join well aware of in terms of working, but sometimes it's forgotten, I suppose, the impact on these. And I suppose if we just maybe branch into them a little bit, I suppose on the physical side, John, we'll move over to yourself in terms of the physical side, the soil health. What are we looking at there, or what comes to mind, or what are the key areas that we really should be focusing on? And I suppose at farm level, what do we need to be aware of?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, you said it there. The 3 pillars must be function well to achieve good crop yields, good soil health overall. One of the props I brought with me to the event was a 3-legged stool, and that's something that we talk about a lot in one of our training modules in Grass and Agro is the 3-legged stool, that each leg is just as important as the 3 pillars of soil health. So just to talk a little bit about the physical pillar first. So when we talk about the physical side of soil health, we're talking about things like the porosity of soil, aggregation, infiltration, structural stability, texture, water storage, things like that. Some labs that are out there that are involved in soil classification look at things like color and texture as well. So there's a lot going on the physical side of things. Take, for example, their porosity. Porosity is very important. It refers to the arrangement of soil aggregates and pores, which directly control the movement of water and air within soil, and therefore indirectly impact soil temperature, which is very important. It's something that we kind of monitor early in the spring, the soil temperatures that are out there when we should go out with maybe our straight nitrogen fertilizer. Then we have the sand, silt, and clay proportion of the soil. I suppose they're distinguished based on their particle size. Sand, silt, and clay and organic matter make up approximately 50-60% of your soil, while water and air make up about 40 to 50%, which quite surprises a lot of people. And so avoiding things like compaction and poaching is very important, because water and air makes up so much of our soil. So avoiding things like compaction, poaching. When we do our grass fest throughout the summer, as part of our Solvita program, we look at, I suppose, the size of aggregates, if there's any oxidation present, the root mat layer, like if we see compaction on farm, it's important to address it. But I suppose crucially, overall, it's important to avoid it in the first case.
Just on, you mentioned the grass fest there, John. I suppose that's a very important thing that I would have gone through the students a good bit with on the day. We've an app in Grass and Agro, so what it does is it gives you a series of questions and you can answer yes or no, and it'll bring you to a figure from 1 to 4. So 1 is obviously a very good soil structure, 4 is a very poor soil structure. So it gives you kind of pictures as well, so you can compare like with like. So that a lot of the students were using that on the day as well. But one thing I suppose they found quite interesting on the day, so I actually dug a sod, let's say from the middle of the field and at the gap of the field. So it was severely compacted. You could see, I suppose you mentioned colour there, the colour of the soil can tell you actually a lot of what's going on. So the compacted soil was a way paler in colour, so it kind of showed that, there was a very little oxygen getting into that soil as well. But there was also kind of like a rusty orangey colour on that sod as well. And that actually tells you a lot, that the soil can be actually quite high in iron. And the problem, I suppose, when your soil is high in iron is you're going to experience phosphorus lockup. And I suppose, we're at a stage now in the game where a lot of farmers don't really have a massive chemical phosphorus allowance. So if you're not getting it from the soil and you can't spread it, your plant is obviously going to be deficient as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And look, what I know myself from looking into compaction before, when you look at some of the research papers that are on it, like, on average, nearly across Ireland, you could be looking at, most places, a 10% impact on yield. It can be significantly more. When you put that across, no matter what the crop, if it's tillage, grass, it's a significant impact when you have to spend, I suppose, the input costs, and then you're getting hit with such a percentage of a reduction.
I find as well, Peter, when you're talking about the grass vests, farmers generally are very, very interested in going out with the rep or whoever's going out doing the dig. It's a very interesting, I suppose, aspect of looking after your farm and the productivity of your land, and they can be there when the assessment is done. And as Claude was saying, the app there is very easy to use. So I think it's a great thing for the farmer as well to actually go out, stand in maybe a field that's underperforming, and to actually see what's going wrong and what the nutrients in our fertilizers or our organic manures are actually doing.
And when you tie that in, I suppose, John, you mentioned already, like the sand, silt, and the clay, like, I suppose, from a nutrient point of view, and holding that in the soil and the influence of the soil, how influential, I suppose, are those different characteristics in terms of behavioural characteristics of the soil?
Yeah, the proportion of sand, silt, and clay has a lot of impacts on how, I suppose, soils behave overall. Take, for example, a sandy soil there. Sandy soils would tend to warm up more rapid than your sand and silt clay soils, but your, I suppose, more clay soils then would retain nutrients a lot better than your sandy soils. So things like that are very important to, I suppose, advise on as well from our own point of view.
Yeah, and that's, I suppose, ultimately when we think of the sand particle, like it's a bigger particle in the soil, more airspace. The air requires a lot less energy. Peace in the springtime, hence you get the earlier growing season. So it's very important, I suppose, just to be aware of all these things. I suppose on the physical piece, any other final thoughts, folks, or will we move on to the next one?
I think on the compaction piece, the most important thing I think is how are we going to alleviate it? we need to identify what the problem is. Look, I suppose the main contributor to compaction is machinery, particularly on the tillage side of things. It's going to suffer a lot more because I suppose you're going out and you're cultivating, you're tilling, you're spraying, you're fertilizing. You know, there's a lot more activity going on there. But in terms of how can we reduce it, you know, if we there are natural ways of trying to reduce it, so minimizing machinery, I suppose, especially in wet weather. You know, there are things you can do in terms of tire pressures, the addition of organic manures. There's soil conditioners as well that can be added to the system. And I suppose, you know, where natural aeration isn't possible, where you know we're dealing with a severely compacted soil, you know, I suppose mechanical intervention might be the last resort. But I suppose, you know, you do need to be very careful when you're using mechanical intervention that, you know, the soil needs to be really dry, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to shatter that kind of plough pan and create, I suppose, cracks in the soil to naturally aerate it. You know, the last thing you want to do is go out when it's a little bit moist and actually start smearing the place. That's when you're going to start making the problem worse, I suppose.
Exactly, yeah. Ultimately, we want an environment where our roots are going to perform well in and, soak up any nutrients that are in the ground. Like Claude will talk about the chemical pillar in a minute, but the likes of phosphorus there, that's very immobile in the soil. We want roots that are hairy and dense, especially in that top 10 centimeters. So having good soil structure, preventing things like compaction are very important in that aspect as well.
And just probably something you mentioned there, which probably when we are talking about compaction that you can't not mention, is the addition of organic matter in terms of how beneficial it is, not just from, I suppose, the workability of a soil in terms of ultimately the organic matter acting like a sponge to absorb some of that traffic compaction, but in terms of, I know something you mentioned already, John, was the aggregate formation. You know, the organic matter, the charge sites in it, ultimately bringing all these soil particles together, form these aggregates, ultimately allowing more pore space, the root penetration, oxygen into the soil, all of which is very important for the soil biology as well. So I suppose just when briefly it was mentioned there on the soil biology and the biological piece, John, what are we talking about there when we come into this aspect?
Yeah, Peter, the biological pillar is also a hugely important aspect of soil health. Typically, in 1 gram of soil, there are about 1 billion types of bacteria and 1 to 3 million fungal hyphae as well. So it's a very complex part of our world. When we talk about the importance of earthworms at work, we talk about the responsibility they have of decomposing organic matter by feeding on debris and as a result making nutrients more available. They stimulate microbial activity. They're responsible for mixing minerals, particles, improving drainage, thanks to their channeling and burrowing. And that kind of ties back to our physical aspect of soil. Their channeling, burrowing activity are creating more pores and improving soil structure overall, and overall land productivity as well. So, in summary, soil organisms and the biological pillar very important for regulating nutrient availability, maintaining soil structure, as I said, important for carbon sequestration as well, and soil oxygenation as well. So when you have more air and more water infiltrating through the soil, you're going to have a lot more productive soils and a better environment, I suppose, for roots to do their job as well.
I think that's very important, John. Like, even I asked on the day to the students, you know, name the three pillars of soil health, and everyone was able to mention the chemical side of it, and a couple of them, you know, were well aware of the physical side and the compaction piece. But I think definitely the biological side can be kind of forgotten. But I suppose, in my own opinion, I think it's nearly one of the most important because, you know, it's the biology in the soil that are going to convert those nutrients that aren't plant available into plant available nutrients. And I suppose anything we can do to create a better environment for them by alleviating the likes of soil compaction, having the optimum pH there, you know, anything we can do to create a better environment for them is what kind of we need to be looking at.
Exactly. And
Mm.
Peter, you said it there about adding your organic manures. Really good at encouraging, I suppose, earthworm activity as well and underperforming fields that might be suffering a little bit from compaction as well. And that kind of comes back to our grass vest and diagnosing maybe a field that's underperforming. And if there's compaction there, it can be a spot maybe to spread your farmyard manure if you have enough of it to go around.
Yeah, and I suppose when we're talking about these organic manures, like I suppose the textbook figure there. I know it's going to vary depending on the type of stock you have and what they're being fed. But if you're looking at typically 5 units of phosphorus on per 1,000 gallons of slurry, that's only looking at what's plant available in that year. But there's always this background release of phosphorus that's going to be broken down over time. And that's what these soil biology, the soil microbes are doing, are actively working. And that's the piece that we want to try and tap into. That'd be kind of, I suppose, a simple analogy. It's something we're doing every year, playing the slurry. But, there's where I suppose they're at work, constantly giving us back this longer term release. Is that a fair way to look at it?
Yeah, 100%, Peter, 100%.
And then I suppose, look, move on over just a wee bit on the chemical side. We're moving rightly through the year of March now. Ideally, we would like to probably be a little further on with it. Where our farm's at the minute, and I suppose what are we looking at?
Yeah, I suppose on the day I would have said to students, before you even start to talk about the chemical side of things, need to have soil sample results that you can look at. And I would have talked to students on the day about the new soil sampling regulation as well, where every soil sample taken now since the 15th of September last year has to be GPS tracked or have a LIPIS number attached to it as well. I suppose just to why does the plant actually need NPK and sulfur as well? Nitrogen is the main driver of plant growth and protein formation, so that's why I suppose we're drip feeding nitrogen to the plant throughout the year. Our phosphorus is going to support our rooting and our tillering. And I suppose, generally we like to apply phosphorus when soils get a little bit warmer above that, 6 degrees. I suppose that's why we like to apply our phosphorus typically in that kind of second fertilizer round when soil starts to get that little bit warmer, and it's going to help set up the plant for the year and help it to tiller. Our K then, I suppose, is responsible for water and nutrient movement throughout the plant. Silage ground typically is the hungriest for K because I suppose when you think of a grazing scenario, nutrients are being recycled the whole time, whereas on a silage ground, for every 1 ton of dry matter you're taking off, you're stripping away, is it 25 kilos of K? So it's very important there that silage ground needs that high amount of K. And sulfur then as well, I suppose, is very important for photosynthesis and protein formation. It is linked to nitrogen in terms of the protein formation piece. So typically on a grazing scenario, we do recommend that 12:1 ratio. And I suppose on a silage per cut, you're kind of talking 16 units an acre. So that's kind of what I would have talked to the students about on the day. But I suppose one very important side of the chemical side of things is your pH. You can spread all the fertilizer you want, but if your pH is off, it's going to severely restrict the amount of nutrients that are going to be able to be uptaken. So I suppose what actually is pH? It's the measure of hydrogen ions in the soil. So the more hydrogen ions you have in the soil, the more acidic it's going to be. So I suppose when we look at the pH scale, it goes from 1 to 14. So, any kind of shift in pH is going to have a dramatic effect. Even if you go like 0.1 down the pH scale, it's going to have a significant effect. I suppose the sweet spot there for a grassland soil is between 6.3 and 6.5. There's not that much of a difference between a pH of 6 and a pH of 6.3. You can slip down there very quickly. And I suppose the problem with that is at a pH of 6, your phosphorus is only 50% available. So it's very important to have that right. And I suppose at that pH, it's the likes of your iron and your aluminium that's going to lock up your phosphorus. But I suppose even on the biology side, earthworms aren't going to want to live in an acidic soil. It's like ourselves putting our hand into a barrel of acid. They're not going to want to live and thrive there as well. And I suppose an acidic pH is also linked to actually roots being stunted as well. So if you think about it, if your phosphorus is locked up, your roots are stunted, and your earthworms aren't going to want to live there, your soil is fairly restricted on what it can actually do for you.
Yeah, you said it all there, Clodagh. Correcting soil pH is critical first step in improving nutrient availability and nitrogen use efficiency as well. Just some figures I was looking at there the last few days from Teagasc, they've shown that the proportion of soils below the critical pH threshold nationally fell to 44%. So that's kind of where we're at nationally. So 44% is still a substantial figure. Overall, they were concluding that more soils are moving towards recommended P&K ranges. However, soil fertility deficits remain widespread across dry stock and tillage systems. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting figure I've seen there the last few days. But yeah, correcting soil pH, something we say as well in grass and agro, is the first thing to get right on farm.
Yeah, and sure, look, it's probably one that I suppose when we look at it historically, I suppose the weather patterns, and we always wanted to try to correct it in the back end, for issues with potentially lime go out before slurry, or can it now, and issues with applying it with different nitrogen fertilizer. So what are we saying on that? I suppose, is there any opportunities mid-season where we may be able to work it in? The fact it is such a important conditioner there, that we, not just from the, I suppose, the nutrient point of view in terms of applying chemical, but also as you alluded to there, the biological piece as well.
Yeah, I suppose with pH, it is a funny one, as you say. Like typically, a lot of farmers do leave it to the back end of the year, but I suppose we can get caught with the way the weather comes at the back end. But I suppose there are a couple of things we need to think about before we go out with lime. So if you're going out with slurry, you can leave a window of kind of typically a week to 10 days before you go with your lime. But if you flip the situation and you go with your lime first, you kind of have to wait a minimum of 3 months there before you go with your slurry, because it can lead to the likes of nitrogen losses, nitrogen volatilization, and things like that. I suppose, look, it's not as talked about this year now, because I suppose we're prohibited from spreading granular unprotected urea, but it's the same scenario there as the slurry.
It's important to note as well,
So,
when you're talking about lime application, when lime is applied to soil, it takes up to 2 years to work its way down through the soil. And from a soil sampling point of view, it's important to wait 2 years before taking a soil sample post lime application as well, because you'll get an inflated pH reading as well. So that's just something to bear in mind as well when you talk about lime and pH.
so really, what you're saying, if you're a two-cut silage system, I'm just going to use silage ground for example, and you get your two cuts of silage off, you put out your slurry, 7 to 10 days later, there's no issue then with going out with your lime,
No,
provided
no,
you have a low cover, you'll
yeah,
not be bringing it back in another cut,
yeah.
and the likes of your MBP urea, your protected urea, there's no issues there then in terms of losing the nitrogen. So really, it's getting, there is decent opportunities there, I suppose, in the middle of the year. Is that fair to say now?
Yeah, I think that's what we're going to have to start looking at, Peter, because it's the same with K applications, getting caught there in the back end of not being able to spread it because the weather just comes against you. And I suppose, we have seen farmers, I suppose, swap to the likes of NK products there in the second half of the year to alleviate that as well. So it's just, to be a bit cuter about it.
Yeah, and I'm just, something that was mentioned there as well. You mentioned sulfur, and why I'm just going to ask you with this is I was out in farm myself there last week, and one farmer says, like, where did all this sort of come from? Sulfur a couple of years ago, there was no talk about it, and why all of a sudden are we applying it now? Did we miss a trick in the past? So you might just maybe give a couple of lines on that. It was something, Joe. It's more than one farmer has said it to me recently.
Yeah, so I suppose on the sulfur piece, Peter, we have targets to meet now in terms of, environmental targets to meet. And I suppose the whole thing around sulfur is to improve nitrogen use efficiency and also for protein formation. So sulfur is really, really important to get in to your silage ground to try and drive those proteins. I suppose typically what we're talking is kind of 16 units an acre per cut on silage ground. And as I said there on the grazing ground, kind of a 12:1 ratio. So for every 12 units of nitrogen, 1 unit of sulfur.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think in
And
recent years, from the environmental point of view, sulfur is taken out of a lot of our fuels. So the fact that there's a lack of sulfur in the system and it's not maybe coming down from the sky and rain or whatever, we have to supplement it as well through our fertilizers as well now.
yes, so we've cleaned up the atmosphere, I suppose, but it's having a knock-on effect, and there's less sulfur ultimately in the soils. That's probably the easiest way then. And I suppose an important piece, it's a bit like nitrogen. It's very easily leached too. So it's kind of, that's what you're saying. Get
Yeah,
with your earlier applications incorporated in the front half of the year as such.
yeah.
Yeah, look, thanks for that, John and Clodagh. And I suppose, look, in the current market, it's probably more important than ever. I suppose with the increased regulation and I suppose the lack of flexibility around, how much chemical we can apply. So, I suppose, what's the thoughts on that? How are farmers faring out, or what are we looking at?
Yeah, I suppose what I would have talked to students about on the day, like why is it important to talk about the three pillars of soil health now, is because I suppose, we need to get access to that background nitrogen that's in the soil. As you said, farmers now are restricted on the amount of chemical nitrogen and phosphorus they can apply. But just an example I've wrote down here, and it really, I suppose, hits home with farmers when you actually say to them is, to grow a ton of grass, it takes 30 kilos of nitrogen, right? And I suppose we're all aiming to grow around that 15 ton of dry matter. That's the aim, okay? So that's to grow 15 tons of dry matter is going to be 450 kilos of nitrogen. But the max chemical nitrogen we can spread is 241 kilos for a farmer that's in the lower band of irrigation. So that's an extra 209 kilos of nitrogen we need to get from somewhere else. So we need to look at options like better use of slurry, so more targeted use of slurry, optimizing soil fertility, so getting your P's and K's to an index of 3 or 4, and optimizing lime usage, creating better conditions for soil biology to aid mineralization, so alleviating the likes of compaction, things like that. And also then, there's a lot of talk about clover as well. That's kind of what we need to be looking at to get that extra bit of nitrogen so that, we can ultimately maintain production at these lower rates of chemical nitrogen and phosphorus.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Clodagh. And look, I suppose it's important, I suppose, again, something we always say, setting out early in the year, I suppose, what allowances you have there to play with, and tearing it on that. So I suppose, look, we covered a lot there. Just to summarise it, maybe, I suppose you've your three pillars of soil health, have to look at them all, I suppose, equally. Any one of them is out of sync, it's going to have an impact on the other. We can apply all the chemical we want, but ultimately, if we have a compacted soil or the soil biology isn't working, we're not going to be getting best use of those nutrients. I suppose you touched a bit more on the chemical too, as well, Clodagh and John. So with the nitrogen, obviously it's very important to establish our allowances, drip feed that throughout the year. Don't forget about the sulphur in terms of improving its efficiency. Where you have the phosphorus allowance, you're saying get it out early springtime, I suppose, as probably looking at realistically from now on, if depending on where you are in the country, as the grass growth starts to, I suppose, increase. And that's ultimately for our rooting. Then for large applications, okay, I think, Clodagh, you said we're targeting them towards the back end. And of course, we can't forget about the lane piece. Take the opportunities mid-season. Did I miss anything? Anyone add anything?
No, I think you have everything there, Peter. I think it's to look at it as like a holistic view. It's physical, chemical, and biological. We all think about the chemical aspect of it. And, to be fair, the physical side of it is becoming a little bit more popular with the likes of, there's a lot of talk about compaction and stuff as well, but it's not to forget about the biology in the soil either, and to, I suppose, take the opportunity to create ideal conditions for them to live in the soil, and any kind of measure you can put in place to do that, I think, isn't going to be money wasted.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing really else to add to that as well. Just keep looking after investing in your soil fertility. It's one of the, I suppose, the non-negotiables. And the parts of looking after your soil and growing more grass is very important economically as well on a farm, which is important too.
Perfect, John. Thanks, Clodagh. So that'll conclude this week's episode, folks. Until the next time, mind yourselves and stay safe.